right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you. Just for a very brief bit of context, we find ourselves in an age where extreme weather events are fast becoming the new normal. 5 years ago, we sort of called them black swan events. Now, the black swan events are now no longer as such. They're more frequent, and we're starting to live and incorporate them into our new normal. You feel bad for Nicholas Taleb, obviously the author of Black Swan, because I think his next book, Extreme Weather Events Are Not Black Swans, might not be as a sexy title as his first one. But we start to see a greater prevalence of drought, of flooding, of extreme rainfall. And of course, this has a socioeconomic impact for those who are experiencing those, particularly in rural areas, needing to find ways to eke out living. That often turns to and has a direct impact on biodiversity loss, and eventually then translates to ecosystem collapse. Sanjeev, I want to perhaps start with you. How do you think about the sort of how we navigate extreme weather events, how we think about that impact on biodiversity loss?
Yeah, interesting that we start with that. I mean, the World Economic Forum in their risk report has extreme climate events as the #1 risk, followed very closely by biodiversity loss and ecosystem destruction. So it doesn't mean that from a long-term risk that it's going to happen in the future. It's happening now already, and we're seeing it playing itself out already, and particularly in a Southern African perspective. So for us as a retailer, where our supply chains are dependent on healthy ecosystems and we rely on ecosystem services, for us it's very important. So, notwithstanding the impacts around climate, notwithstanding what's happening with biodiversity, the challenges are always around, so what? So what do we do about it? What can we do about it? And I think, from a lot of it is around how do we mainstream some of these issues into our own operations. And I'll leave it there, and perhaps we'll come back to that point.
I want to touch on you've mentioned, Shoprite's corporate strategy, considering this, and perhaps, Nela, I'd like you to add on to this. We heard yesterday Gareth Ackerman, the non-executive director of Pick n Pay, talking about how they've addressed food insecurity through meat and meat-based alternatives to increase protein intake at some of their lower income stores. It still remains a trade. Well, I think in many instances, it still remains a trade-off for the sort of lower income portion of the population, the rural areas, particularly in Africa. But it cannot remain a trade-off. It needs to be an economic and a corporate strategy. Sanjeev and Nela, perhaps you want to elaborate on that.
Yes. So a lot of what we're looking at Obudu Capital is how do we integrate these policies together to support not just the local communities, but also all the way up the food chain. I think someone mentioned earlier, at the end of the day, financial institutions, businesses, they want to make money, right? So one of the companies that we have invested in is a agri-tech company in East Africa. And some of the work that they do with smallholder farmers is that they allow them to measure the soil nutrients as they're farming. This then leads to them being able to buy fertilizers that are better use case, also ends up with them reducing the amount of money they spend, increasing the yield, etc. So that is a clear case study of how it's able to not just profit the farmers, those at the lower end, but also have a longer term effect on the biodiversity and the ecosystem, and then also those who are investing in the companies.
Yeah, Sam, to follow up on that, it's a lot more complicated than what Gareth made it out to
Absolutely,
be.
No, of course.
And I'm not saying that because it's Pick n Pay and we are Shoprite.
I think this is a safe space. You're welcome to say that.
Absolutely. But I think the point, importantly, I think the aspect is around affordability. How do we bring affordable products that are responsibly sourced to the mainstream? And I think that's really when we're able to move the needle in terms of biodiversity and in terms of sustainability as a whole. It's easy to sell products that are responsibly sourced, that are expensive to high and affluent customers, but how do we make it affordable?
Yeah.
How do we mainstream it?
Yeah. Absolutely, I agree 100% with that. Our biggest challenge is the affordability, because we always think of sustainability as all those people with a good heart are going to do it, people close to nature. But at the end of the day, it's an economic question. It's an economic factor. So unless we can make biodiversity real and get access to rural and where there is a food need, our work that we do is we spend a lot of time talking about energy yesterday, which was very interesting, and the grids and the small grids and the big grids. And I think we can take that example and that model and apply it to a slightly different angle to energy. And that is, how do we green our infrastructure? How do we green our buildings? And so we have seen an opportunity through the Footsteps Foundation and some of the work that we do on equitable green outcomes, that we need to make a systemic change in South Africa, in Africa, in the world, starting in Africa. And I think in Africa we have a huge opportunity because we have not industrialized as much as part of other parts of the world. So we have an opportunity to have many more small components within value chains that can also feed into the energy cycle. And I'm not talking about electricity supply, I'm talking about how we design buildings, how we design infrastructure. I was listening to a Economist Impact webinar on Tuesday about the retrofitting of, in Europe, of the urban and the old style buildings where obviously requires a lot of heat in winter. So we have seen an opportunity to make quite a big shift in an industry, and I think we need to work at the industry level as well. So we have decided as a foundation that that is where we want to inspire the change to create energy efficiency. And coming back to how do we create that, it is that we can grow agriculture, moving slightly away from the food focus to textile focus. So it's textiles, insulation. So I want to talk a little bit about the wool industry, because not many people talk about it, and it's one of our oldest industries in our country, and one of the most sustainable industries. So I think we have a big chunk of a country that focuses on wool farmers, and how do we take that? I don't want to keep the...
I just want to touch on that.
Go
I think
for it.
it's really interesting what you said. So when I actually initially started doing our thesis for the fund that we now have, I actually was focused around biomimicry, because by night I'm a conservationist. Don't tell anyone. So we were doing our research on biomimicry, and infrastructure is a big component of that, because you've seen these eco cities, and even though we still do invest in sustainable infrastructure, it's still one of those sectors that has a lot of reliance on government and regulations. And I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about that later on. But it's something that a lot of countries in Africa are still grappling with. In Nigeria, we have severe flooding, which I spoke about yesterday, sorry. And we are still grappling with the role that the government plays in this changeover to a more sustainable city.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the whole green insulation component, and how do we build buildings, is a huge opportunity. And the beauty of that is that we can create so many value chains with alien removals, towards balancing nature, allowing nature to balance itself. I think that is where we want to go.
Can we take one step back? Where this all began, you were talking about droughts.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a conservationist and I'm a wildlife activist. You know, my priority right now is to end the rhino crisis. And for us, the end game is legislation. We don't have that. That's why we still have a rhino crisis, because most of the poachers don't go to prison. And the people that are working on this and have been working on it for 10, 15 years, they didn't choose to go to war. They were conservationists. They would much rather be dealing with the issues that, like weather, like drought. And, for us, we're talking about, okay, how do you make sustainability, an economic decision? As charities that are just trying to survive, and that's, we're a small charity doing really big things, we've realized that we can't actually just count on donor money because it's so unreliable. A year ago, my charity Saving the Wild, we lost our big donor who was one of the major producers of Manuka honey in the world, and they just suddenly tanked overnight and we lost most of our funding. And so I had to make a decision, how are we going to continue? And so I made the decision that we had to own the products. And so this week, I'm sure many of you would have seen on the big screens here, you've got Saving the Wild and wall art, which is these large-scale pieces which we're going to be proposing to residential, corporate, hotels, lodges. And so that percentage of those sales goes directly towards us protecting endangered species. And then in January, we're launching Saving the Wild wines. And so, we're going to be going to Woolworths, to Gareth Ackerman, to Pick and Pay, to Shoprite and saying, we've got the grapes, we've got the award-winning wine. We're not asking for a handover, we're not asking for a handout. What we're saying is, if you buy our products, we will save the rhino. Because I cornered the minister yesterday after his keynote speech. And, because while I was cornered a year ago after my speech here, I don't know if anybody was here last year and heard me speak, but, I spoke about our struggles for a decade. We went after a lot of bad guys. We went after the poaching kingpins, the corrupt judges, the court president himself who's facing possible life in prison. I personally exposed a syndicate of magistrates taking bribes on child rape, human trafficking, and rhino poaching. And all these people are still out there living the good life, except we got a bit lucky with the Kruger kingpin. He was assassinated. But the rest are out there. I mean, the court president himself, since he's been suspended, has earned over R1 million just sitting on his sofa doing nothing, And so as I left the stage, there was a person in the audience, Ernst Miller, from Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer, and I don't know if Ernst is here today, but he was like, I want to help you. Like, I will work pro bono. I will write the legislation. The government doesn't have to say it's too much work. We'll just do it for them. And so that's what we did. And that's what we've been doing. Thank you to The Economist for putting us together. And so we submitted that legislation 2 months ago. When I met with the minister yesterday, he didn't even know about it because, we'd just been messed around by his officers. Now he does. And now he has no excuse. In fact, within 45 minutes, we gave him a printed copy, obviously, homework, Minister. But within 45 minutes, his office got hold of us and said, send us the digital copies. This is important to us. But do you know why? Because what I'm saying here is, if we can solve the poaching crisis, we will free up hundreds of millions of rands in private funding and taxpayer funding. And which, by the way, you're paying for that court president who's credited a syndicate of corrupt magistrates, you're paying for his salary too. And then we can work on conservation issues such as drought mitigation and climate change mitigation. Does anybody here have any idea why there's no minimum sentencing? Why, if you kill a rhino today, you're probably not going to go to prison, you'll probably just get a fine. Does anybody know why? Well, I told you just now. Because our prisons are full.
Yeah.
And I knew that because the Deputy Minister of Justice told me this a few years ago. And then the minister confirmed it to me yesterday. Well, we will build a prison. We will build a prison for the poachers because I can promise you it's a lot cheaper than the amount of money that we're spending on anti-poaching, but we need money. So if Shoprite would consider buying our wine, or if Woolworths would consider buying our wine, and if one of you might, want to create a space in your offices and, if you don't have an office, you have a home. Consider making space for nature.
So happy to buy the wine.
Thank you.
Drink the wine as well, and to sell it on our shelves as well.
No,
But I think, when we talk about conservation and we talk about biodiversity, of course, it goes beyond just saving the rhino. It's also about saving the honeybee.
Oh, it's all endangered species. It's not just
Yeah, I mean, if the list goes on,
Yeah.
It's also about preserving livelihoods. So, for example, fishing and fishing communities.
100%.
So I think, the focus has to be not just on one specific area. And that's why this biodiversity and biodiversity conservation is so complicated.
Yeah.
It's unlike climate where, in terms of mitigating it, if you reduce your greenhouse gas emissions and you're more efficient, then 1 + 1 is equal to 2. With biodiversity, very often 1 + 1 isn't equal to 2. So I think, as a corporate, we're trying to navigate into that space in terms of what is it that we need to do. And often, I say frameworks are important in being able to quantify and qualify, but doing is better. And that's what we want to identify. What is it that we need to do to actually make sure that our biodiversity is preserved and ecosystem.
And you're 100%. And what I should have said is the legislation is for endangered species. So it's not just rhinos, it's pangolins, cheetahs, it's everything. But what Gareth said yesterday, he was correct. One salary, you're looking at dependencies of 10 people. I live in Greater Kruger in a village, and whether it's the person that's the tracker or the person in the kitchen or the people working in the vehicles, they've got like 7, 8, 9, 10 dependencies. So this is actually human issues. Animal issues are human issues.
Colin, can I bring us back to the section of, I mean, we've talked about the complexity of the issue, and regulation has to play a role. Is it fair, and perhaps my other panelists can dive in on this, is regulation moving fast enough, and is it targeted at the sort of understanding the complexities of the socioeconomic issues on the ground of dependency ratios that are far higher than in urban areas? Is it transcending into ensuring that enforcement is in place properly and is enforced properly on the ground? What you've mentioned here is clearly not a regulatory issue, but a systemic failure of the ability to enforce, judicial standards. How do we start at regulation, but ensure that business is playing a role across the whole value chain of this?
Yeah, but look, I think in general in Africa, our biodiversity legislation or laws that specifically focus on protecting biodiversity is, I'd say, a little bit lacking. Predominantly, our legislation looks at where you've got big project developments at doing impact assessments, and you find out what's your impact, off you go, you develop your project. But I think, like we've seen now from these discussions, is that it's much more complex than just doing an initial impact assessment, off you go, you do your business. I think perhaps legislation should move in a direction of perhaps creating more incentives for companies to contribute to protecting biodiversity. You mentioned the energy sector. I think a big practical example is if you look at our maps of electricity infrastructure, like grid power lines, it crisscrosses the entire country. There's a massive opportunity there to link up ecosystems, to make sure that protected areas aren't isolated. But we need those entities who are in charge of the grid infrastructure, those type of things, to assist in creating these corridors that's so necessary to conserve our biodiversity. So I think that there needs to be a shift in the legislation, and to look at better ways of getting the private sector involved in wanting to make a contribution to conserving.
I'd like to push back ever so slightly. So you said in Africa, we have lax biodiversity laws, and that is true in certain geographies. But Nigeria, surprisingly, has incredible biodiversity laws. And we actually have one that's going through the House of Representation right now. But the issue, again, similar to here, is the enforcement of it that lacks. And even more than that, it's at the community level. So with my conservation site, we have community-based conservation. We not wine, but honey. And we used to do temperate fruits and vegetables to empower the local community. But they aren't incentivized enough. So that's where the private sector is able to come in, because if you don't know where your next meal is coming from tomorrow, who cares if they cut down a tree?
Because I mean, it's so difficult to assign a value to biodiversity. So why do we need to protect it if we can't put some sort of economic value on it? So I guess there needs to be some other method, and we need to probably get a bit creative on how we incentivize and how do we get people to buy into it.
Should it be corporate-led? I see there's a question from the audience. How does Shoprite ensure suppliers follow its diversity policy, especially in agriculture?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, particularly when you have supply chains that are so deep, when you're dealing with multiple tiers in terms of your suppliers. So we've got a position, or we've got a policy in terms of biodiversity. We've got a supplier code of conduct, which we expect our suppliers to adhere to, as at a very fundamental point in terms of complying with the legislation. But I think, more important than that is that if you, as the audience, leave this room today, and hopefully you take some points from this panel, not the fact that we don't have any legislation, not the fact that there's lawlessness in terms of poaching, but what is it that you can do to preserve biodiversity? And that's why we talk about mainstreaming. So when we mainstream biodiversity, it's also about, if we can reduce the amount of food waste that we have, then it means we need to grow less food. We need to have lesser impacts on the environment. So, and particularly wasting food at either retail or household level is probably the worst place where you can waste it, because that's where it's accumulated all the resources, from energy, water, even land and biodiversity. So fundamental things like that, saving or reducing the amount of water that you consume, reducing the amount of energy that you consume. As a corporate, these are things that we could do. Beyond then the direct projects or programs that we have around biodiversity, but these are the direct things that we could do to actually mainstream it.
I'd love to piggyback off that point, because I definitely am in agreement. There is a role for the customer and the people to drive this forward, because if we're thinking about it, businesses wouldn't change the practices unless policies introduce or profit. And then there's also the social impact capital that they're able to gain from becoming more sustainable. But there is a big role that the consumers can play in this fight against the deforestation and biodiversity loss. And more importantly, on the business side, it's also for them to examine their supply chain. Like, what can you change? If you're looking at logistics, maybe you convert to CNGs. How are you interacting with your local populations? But it takes the business actually making those intentional changes, in the same way it takes the individual in the home to stop wasting their food, electricity, etc. Then businesses also have to make those intentional decisions to reduce their impact.
Karin, I know you're about to add on. I just want to, and I was going to ask.
So the question about farming and arid land, so I wanted to pick
Okay,
up on that.
please go ahead, but I do have a question for you after this.
Oh,
Go
okay,
ahead.
great. Okay, so I think if we can make a distinction between conservation and biodiversity, and Sanjeev, you touched on that point, is that we really need to make a systemic change into everybody's lives. And I think agriculture is one of those industries that we can do it. And not only for the food security, that is huge, but if you look broader at that as well, we can look at the whole packaging industry, which we know is one of the biggest. So I always look at the 80-20 principle of where can you make the biggest impact with the least amount of effort. So we have to look at inclusiveness in terms of agriculture, and arid land is something that we have a problem with. We have a problem in this country also with land restitution and ownership of land. So there are solutions, but it's all about, and it can be done under the umbrella of sustainability. So we have 2.2 million hectares of state land. I'm not going to go into a political discussion, but I mean, we have state land that can be converted into diverse agricultural crops. And livestock, okay. We have a discussion coming. Retaining the biodiversity. It's all about diversity in agriculture, keeping the corridors with bees.
We've already lost so
And also,
much.
I mean, even in the...
How much more do you want from us? Like, I mean, like elephants have become, not in South Africa, but like we talk about corridors, elephants have become refugees, like clinging to the last slithers of landscape in Kenya. Like, I'm here talking about poaching because that's the urgency in South Africa. But, Nela and I were discussing it before. We're producing honey and working with nature, but creating products that we can work with nature to protect the Kamana Wildlife Corridor in Kenya. Now, that land is owned by the Maasai people, and then the profits from the sale of the honey goes into school scholarships for their children. And the beekeepers are the young girls we're basically protecting them from early marriage. So there's ways that you can support nature and need and create products that actually create stronger biodiversity. but we can't be clearing too much land because we don't really have much left.
I mean, if you fly into Cape Town Airport and you look at out of the window and you see the local renosterveld, there's 1 or 2 hills around here. It's one of the most endangered vegetation types we have in South Africa. And unfortunately, I think a lot of your products are grown in the Swartland area. So, yeah, I think there needs to be almost a stop on it. We need to say we can't
When the
clear
land is
anymore.
gone, you can't get it back.
But I think therein lies that complexity and that balance. Because on the one hand, we have to feed a growing population. On the other hand, we have to protect the environment and we have to protect the biodiversity. Because I think there's a trade-off within that. And, without the ecological services that we get from natural ecosystems, then we can't grow any food either. So I think, whether it is around subsistence farming or commercial farming, these are the sort of aspects that we need to start bringing in. How do we do both? I think we're not in a situation where it's one or the other.
Yeah,
It's both.
Let me perhaps ask this. We've spoken about dependence. In places like Kruger, where you have a breadwinner needing to feed multiple households and so forth. Is this the space of corporate, or do you think this is something that needs to be in the policy and government as an enabler, where perhaps the discussion needs to also focus on the suppliers that you're drawing from? Or is there an emphasis on understanding their socioeconomic living conditions? We understand that at farm gate, practices may remain ethical in sourcing of avos or macadamias, but you're drawing from families that are supporting an outsized amount of dependence as opposed to other areas. Without a focus on this, we're not really tackling one of the key issues that are affecting biodiversity loss. What are your thoughts on that as my whole panel? Talking about systemic change, that was my question.
Yeah, systemic change. Yes, we need systemic change. So there's a lot of things that we need to turn around. So I absolutely agree with supply chains is one of the opportunities that we have to give small farmers access to markets. So the whole range from the subsistence farmers right through to actually put them in a value chain within an industry. So I think the systemic change needs to happen at an industry level. So influencing industries, like, for example, your packaging industry, looking at natural. So part of what we do also promoting an industry around the packaging industry and insulation, which are the two core things in natural fiber that I think are relatively simple for new farmers to start doing. At a very basic, low-cost level, and then feeding. But one needs to put those new farmers in a value chain, in a supply chain, to the corporates and to the retailers. So it's a systemic change. We need to think differently about it. So it's more about creating an ecosystem, because small subsistence farmers are struggling to get market access. And so the governance of that whole process, and it's a multidisciplinary, as you say, Sanjeev, it's a multidisciplinary challenge across disciplines, across departments that you have to work with. So I think that's why what I meant with systemic change is you need to govern this whole process slightly differently, because it needs to be inclusive, it needs to equitable prosperity for all participants, market access, gate price for their produce, whatever it is that they produce, education. It's a whole systemic thing that we need to do.
And we've been talking about this for, 10 or 20 years. Like,
Yeah.
I think
So
we should
how do
just
we do it is the question.
I think people must just do it. We do it. We do it in Kenya with the honey. We're selling our honey. Shoprite has an opportunity. We're going to have a chat afterwards about the wine. You know what I mean? Let's just do it. Let's just get up on stage and talk about the things that we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you say, we're not suggesting as well, and certainly not from ourselves, that, we transition all of our agriculture into small scale. There's still that need to
Absolutely
have
not.
commercial farms where the losses
Very
are lower,
important.
where the efficiencies in terms of
100%.
generation, the generation per ton or per hectare is a lot higher. I think, it's not one or the other, and that there's some middle ground, and that's what we need to explore.
Yeah.
There's an interesting question from the audience, and I'd like to to just explore this a little bit more. Wildlife activism has a problematic legacy in Africa. How might activists acknowledge and draw humility from their past to inform the way forward? And perhaps this talks to innovation in wildlife activism. What do you see as the next step? Do you agree with this statement, Jamie?
Well, I think wildlife activists are an endangered species.
Okay.
I mean, what is an activist? I mean, there's not that many of us that are putting our lives on the line every day. I see it, I draw the line between activists and conservationists. I'm an activist and a conservationist. There's a number on my head.
Okay.
But my very close friend of mine, Dr. Jane Goodall, passed away a few weeks ago. And she was the one who started this legislation campaign with me a year ago. And, I see how she inspired the world, a global icon, and generations, and was this oracle for hope. I think we need more Jane Goodalls in the world. Certainly not me. I don't have time to go around talking to people. I do this once a year. But
so what is the way forward? What is the innovation that will allow us to increase the stock of?
I think we need, and it's not that I'm anti-speaking in public. I'd love to do it, but not 300 days a year. The corporate world needs to give conservationists and activists a platform to speak, to tell our stories. Like, I'm not saying, give the money to saving the wild, buy wall art, although please do buy wall art and please do buy our wine, but please stop throwing money at the wrong places. Stop giving the money to the charities that aren't on the ground, because all you're doing is you're funding people overseas, sitting in air-conditioned offices. It's administration. I can personally introduce you to the wardens of the Timbavati and the wardens of the Sabi Sand, and people that are generally on the ground, dirt under their shoes, that are doing the work, and you can give the money to them, but just keep it on the ground.
I just want to quickly, I love rhinos, but I am also a big birder. And while I think that, there's some species that I do think is a little bit easier to conserve or to get funding for, like the rhinos. It's a big charismatic species. But we've got one of the most endangered species of bird in South Africa, the Botas lark. There's about 300 individuals left in the wild.
The legislation is endangered, so we'll save your bird too.
But the problem is that there's so many of these funds, and I guess you all fight for funding, but there needs to be
It's got to be generational decision making. What is the game changers? Because so much money is wasted. Like there's a lot of good charities out there, and there's a lot of bullshit. And you really got to sift through it. And vultures are endangered. They are the cleanup crew. We've had hundreds of vultures that were poisoned in the last few months.
Just recently
in Kruger, and it was devastating. And I was there for the release of the ones that were saved, and it was so emotional. It was like, we got to look after the ugly ones too, because otherwise there's going to be carcasses everywhere, So I'm with you 100%. We are the game changers. Please don't come to me and say, I want to save the orphans. I also want to save the orphans. They're really cute and cuddly, but let's save the mother, let's, and these are keystone species. So, when you protect the rhino and you've got all these boots on the ground, you're protecting all animals in that ecosystem, and you're protecting all the people that are working in the kitchen and the laundry, the trackers and the guides, and all those livelihoods. So 100,000 people in that wildlife industry, that's 1 million people you're protecting.
In the interest of trying to hit the buzzer beater, some potential last thoughts, because I see we're in under a minute. Perhaps very quickly, panelists, if you'd like to give one last thought, perhaps Sanjeev, Karin, Nela.
Yeah, I think it's what you take away from the session, and I've said it before. It's around, how do you make a difference as an individual? What is it that you can do to minimize your environmental footprint?
Karin?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we have great enablers at the moment to do that. With AI, we had a lovely discussion yesterday in the CSO Club about AI and the role of AI in sustainability support. FinTech, there are great examples. So we think biodiversity cannot be funded or doesn't have a funding model. There's huge opportunity for creativity in that space. And technology in general, so access to technology, yes.
Nela, final.
Yes, I would say on the technology point that we see, throughout Africa, you have the carbon credits, you have different forms of funding that are supporting the natural space. But then you have countries like mine where it's a bit more challenging because we don't have the legislature fully in. And so it's pushing the governments to act, but also making those conscious decisions, like was already said, about what you can do as a consumer to have a positive effect on the supply chain.
Guys, wow, this was a
Time.
fantastic discussion. I think the audience, the reaction is showing such. Thank you for the engagement.